The year is 1532. Inside a royal chapel in London, a friar named William Peto climbs to the pulpit. Henry VIII is seated right there in the front row, the most powerful man in England. A king already ripping the Catholic Church apart, piece by piece, so he could cast off his wife and make sure no one on earth could tell him no. Then Peto opens his mouth, and what he says is almost suicidal. He looks straight at Henry, in front of the entire court, and warns him that if he keeps going, if he defies God, abandons his queen, and twists the church to fit his own desires, he will die like the biblical king Ahab. And what happened to Ahab? Dogs licked his blood from the ground. The whole chapel freezes. Total silence. The kind of silence so complete it feels alive. Henry has Peto arrested, banished, erased. And then, like kings often do, he moves on. What Henry does not know, what nobody in that room could possibly imagine, is that the friar's warning will come true almost word for word, in ways so grotesque and so precise, they feel less like coincidence and more like judgment. But to understand how a king ends up trapped inside a prophecy he tried to silence, you first have to understand what Henry was before the decay began. Because Henry VIII's transformation is only truly horrifying when you understand what he transformed from. Welcome to Rotten Ages, where we go to the places history textbooks are usually too polite to enter. If you're new here, subscribe. You're going to want to stay for this one. When Henry VIII took the throne in 1509 at just 18 years old, the English court practically breathed out in relief. His father, Henry VII, had been cautious, cold, suspicious, and famously tight with money. The new king seemed like the exact opposite. He was over 6 feet tall, enormous by Tudor standards, broad-shouldered, blonde, athletic, dazzling. He could ride harder, hunt longer, joust better, and shoot straighter than nearly anyone in England. And he made sure people saw it, because Henry understood something instinctively. Physical power was political power. But it wasn't just his body that impressed people. Erasmus, one of the greatest scholars in Europe, had known Henry as a boy and wrote about him with open admiration. He spoke Latin, French, and Spanish fluently. He debated theology with serious intellectuals and held his ground. He played the lute. He composed music, real music, not just ceremonial pageantry, and some of it is still performed today. Thomas More, who Henry would later send to his death, described the young king as humane, refined, and intellectually generous, and this wasn't empty praise. Independent observers from different countries, with no reason to flatter the same man in the same way, kept saying essentially one thing. Henry VIII, in the beginning, seemed like the most impressive ruler in Europe. That matters. Because this is not the story of a monster who was always a monster. This is not a story about a tyrant simply revealing his true self. This is a story about total transformation. By the time Henry died in 1547, he barely resembled the young king who had taken the throne in 1509. Not physically, not mentally, not in any way that would have felt recognizable. By the end, he weighed somewhere around 160 to 180 kilograms. His waist measured roughly 137 centimeters. His legs were covered in open, infected wounds that had been festering for years. The smell of his body could be detected from rooms away. He had to be moved through his own palaces in a wheeled chair. He was hauled up staircases with ropes and pulleys like freight. So how does that happen? How does the Golden Prince of Europe become, in about 30 years, a nearly immobile, rotting, paranoid figure while an entire court pretends not to smell what is happening to him? That's the real question, and the answer is more medically specific and far more disturbing than most people realize. Because everything changes on January 24th, 1536. Henry is 44 years old. He's heavier now, yes, but still unmistakably powerful. At a tournament in Greenwich, he falls. His horse crashes down, and Henry, wearing full armor, carrying the weight of both man and metal, hits the ground hard. Then the horse falls on top of him. Henry is unconscious for 2 hours. For those 2 hours, the court believes the King of England is dead. Henry eventually wakes up. The court exhales in relief. Officially, the story ends there. A frightening accident, a lucky recovery, and life moving forward. But that isn't what actually happened. Because while Henry stood up again, something inside him did not heal. And the first sign of that appears in his leg. The accident at Greenwich was violent enough to cause deep internal trauma. Modern medical historians believe the fall likely damaged the periosteum, the thin membrane that surrounds the bone itself. It's the kind of injury that might not look catastrophic at first glance. But in 1536, without antibiotics and without modern surgical care, that kind of damage could quietly become lethal. The wound became infected, and what Henry most likely developed was something called osteomyelitis, a chronic bacterial infection inside the bone itself. This is not a simple injury. You can't clean it properly. You can't bandage it away. The bacteria settle deep in the bone, multiplying slowly, forming abscesses that periodically force their way outward through the skin. They rupture, drain, partially close, and then become infected again. Over and over. It's a cycle that, without modern medicine, rarely ends. And this is where the transformation truly begins. Before 1536, Henry VIII had been one of the most physically active men in Europe. He hunted, jousted, rode horses for hours, trained constantly. His identity, his entire sense of kingship, was tied to his physical strength. After the accident, that changed. The injury made movement painful. Eventually, it made serious activity impossible. Now imagine the habits Henry already had. Royal banquets weren't just meals, they were political theater. Kings displayed power through excess. Enormous quantities of meat, rich food, and wine consumed daily in front of an audience. Henry already ate like a king. Now he couldn't move like one. The result was predictable and brutal. Weight increased rapidly. The extra weight placed more pressure on the damaged leg. More pressure worsened the infection. The worsening infection increased the pain, and the pain made movement even more impossible. Every problem fed the next one. Obesity worsened the infection. The infection increased immobility. Immobility increased obesity. It became a perfect cycle of physical collapse. And it all started with a horse falling on him one afternoon in January. But here's something documentaries about Henry VIII almost never talk about. His doctors were not helping. In fact, in several very specific ways, they were making everything worse. This isn't a criticism of individual physicians. Henry's medical team included some of the most respected doctors in England. The problem was that the entire medical system they were trained in was fundamentally wrong. Tudor medicine was based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, according to this theory, came from imbalance between these fluids. Treatment meant restoring balance, and when it came to infected wounds, that idea led to one particularly disastrous practice. Doctors believed wounds had to stay open. If a wound closed, The humors, the poisonous fluids causing the illness, would be trapped inside the body. So whenever Henry's ulcers began to heal, whenever the tissue started to scar over naturally, his physicians would reopen them, deliberately. The one thing that might have allowed the body to heal was the one thing his doctors were trained to prevent. And that was only the beginning. When the infections became severe and the ulcers produced pus and dead tissue, physicians applied heated iron directly to the wound. The idea was to burn away the infection. In reality, this only caused additional trauma. The infection inside the bone remained untouched, while the surrounding tissue was repeatedly damaged. Henry also liked to experiment with medicine himself. He kept a private pharmacy inside his chambers and took pride in mixing his own treatments. One of his favorite remedies involved grinding pearls into a fine powder and mixing them into ointments. Gemstones were believed to carry healing properties. Pearls, specifically, were thought to purify the body and draw out poison. Henry spent enormous amounts of money on pearls. His legs continued to rot. His personal physician, Dr. Butts, followed a routine when dressing the wounds. First, he would cut away the cloth coverings from Henry's leg. Then he'd apply a sponge soaked in alcohol and mandrake juice. The mandrake acted as a crude anesthetic, dulling the pain enough for what came next. Then the wound was packed with a mixture of goat fat and burnt lead. Lead, doctors believed, could draw infection out of the tissue. What it actually did was slowly introduce lead poisoning directly into an open wound in a body already struggling with infection and poor circulation. Bone infection, obesity, possible diabetes, lead exposure, and the treatments continued. Thomas Vickery, Henry's royal surgeon and a respected medical authority of the time, recommended a particularly bizarre procedure for drawing out deep infection. You take a live chicken, you pluck the feathers from its underside, then you press the bare skin of the bird directly against the wound and hold it there until the animal absorbs the poison from the body and dies. Then you replace it with another chicken and another. Henry VIII had live chickens pressed against his rotting legs by royal physicians. This was not rumor. It was documented medical practice. In March of 1538, something strange happened. For a short time, the ulcers appeared to close. The court doctors interpreted this as improvement. To support the healing tissue, they tightly bandaged the king's legs. Within days, Henry was nearly dead. The infection, trapped inside without an outlet, had turned inward. Tissue was beginning to die from the inside out. A physician named Dr. Lind recognized the early signs of advancing gangrene and ordered the bandages removed immediately. That decision may have saved Henry's life, but only temporarily. Because the deeper transformation, the one happening slowly inside his body, was still underway. The physical decline continued. The weight kept rising. Movement became more difficult. The pain grew sharper, more constant. Month by month, year by year, the man who had once been the physical ideal of European kingship became harder and harder to recognize. But now we reach the part of the story that almost nobody talks about. Because understanding it means stepping outside the dramatic narrative and into medical territory that is complicated and unsettling. Was Henry's transformation really just the result of injury, weight gain, and terrible medical treatment? Modern researchers increasingly believe there may have been something else at work. Possibly two underlying biological conditions that historians largely ignored for centuries, but which suddenly make Henry's story look very different. The first is something called McLeod syndrome. It's an extremely rare genetic condition, so rare that only around 150 cases have ever been formally documented worldwide. The disorder is caused by the absence of a particular protein on the surface of red blood cells, known as the KX antigen. What caught historians' attention, though, wasn't just the physical symptoms. It was the psychological ones. McLeod syndrome produces a slow, progressive change in personality. Patients often experience loss of impulse control, worsening judgment, antisocial behavior, bursts of violent anger, paranoia, and deep depression. And these changes don't happen suddenly. They unfold gradually over years. Friends and family often describe patients as becoming completely different people from who they used to be. Calm individuals become volatile. Rational thinkers become erratic. Kind people grow cruel. Now think about the historical records surrounding Henry VIII. In 1509, nearly every observer described him the same way: charismatic, generous, intellectually curious, energetic. But by the 1530s, reports begin to shift. Henry becomes more volatile, prone to sudden rages, increasingly suspicious of the people around him. By the 1540s, the transformation is unmistakable. He is paranoid, unpredictable, capable of ordering executions with almost casual indifference. The court around him becomes a place of constant fear, where even the most loyal servants never feel entirely safe. The pattern is strikingly similar to the progression seen in McLeod syndrome. And importantly, the psychological changes appear to accelerate alongside his physical decline. Now, we cannot prove this diagnosis. Henry's remains have never undergone modern genetic testing. But the theory explains the trajectory of his personality far more convincingly than the traditional explanation that power simply corrupted him. The second theory is quieter, but perhaps even more devastating. Look at the reproductive history of Henry's marriages. Catherine of Aragon experienced at least 6 pregnancies. Only 1 child survived infancy. Anne Boleyn had 3 pregnancies. 1 daughter survived. 1 late miscarriage. 1 final pregnancy that ended in a severely malformed fetus. Jane Seymour produced the long-awaited male heir, Edward, but died from complications shortly after childbirth. For centuries, historians blamed this tragic pattern on the dangers of Tudor childbirth. But in recent years, 2 medical researchers proposed a different explanation. If Henry carried a rare genetic trait known as the KEL-positive blood group antigen, it could explain the entire pattern. Here's how it works. During a first pregnancy, the mother's immune system usually tolerates the fetus, even if the father carries the KEL antigen. But after that first exposure, the mother's body can become sensitized. In future pregnancies, her immune system may produce antibodies that attack any fetus carrying that same antigen. Essentially, the mother's body begins destroying the developing child. The medical pattern this creates is chillingly familiar. 1 or 2 early successful pregnancies, followed by increasing miscarriages, stillbirths, and severe fetal abnormalities. Exactly what we see across Henry's marriages, which means the king who executed wives for failing to produce sons may have been biologically responsible for those lost pregnancies himself. Of course, Henry never knew. No one in Tudor England had the scientific framework to even ask the question. But if this theory is correct, then Henry's story wasn't just shaped by power or personality. It was written quietly and invisibly into his blood. And by the 1540s, the physical consequences of everything, injury, infection, obesity, bad medicine, and possibly genetics, were impossible to hide. There's another detail about Henry VIII that rarely appears in popular portraits of him. He was a profound hypochondriac. The French ambassador to England, wrote home describing Henry as almost obsessively fearful of illness. Whenever plague or sweating sickness appeared near the court, Henry would flee to a rural palace with almost no warning. Ministers were left behind. Courtiers were abandoned. On at least one occasion, he even left his own wife behind in the rush to escape potential infection. Every morning, physicians examined him. He maintained his private pharmacy and compounded medicines himself. That meant regular access to substances widely used at the time, including mercury-based treatments commonly prescribed for syphilis. Some historians believe long-term mercury exposure may have contributed to the neurological deterioration seen during Henry's final decade. So the psychological portrait becomes even stranger. A king obsessed with his own health, terrified of disease, while projecting the image of an invincible ruler chosen by God. The gap between the image and reality was becoming enormous, and the body count of his reign continued to grow. We won't go through every execution, but the scale matters. The young king who inspired admiration across Europe would eventually execute 2 of his 6 wives, his closest childhood friend, his chief minister Thomas Cromwell, several members of his extended family. Across the broader religious purges and destruction of monasteries, historians estimate that somewhere between 57,000 and 72,000 people died during his reign. By the 1540s, survival at Henry's court required a specific skill. You never contradicted him. You never questioned a decision, even if it completely reversed something he had ordered years earlier. And under no circumstances did you acknowledge the smell. By 1543, contemporary accounts described the odor of infection from Henry's legs as detectable from several rooms away. Multiple sources mention it. Physicians dealt with it daily. His 5th wife, Catherine Howard, only 19 years old when she married him, was said to weep privately about the reality of sharing a bed with a man whose body was, quite literally, decomposing while he was still alive. She was executed at 19. Henry was 50. He weighed roughly 400 pounds and had open wounds that smelled of decay. She did not choose that marriage. No one ever said no to Henry VIII.